Okay, so the second historical motivation for theatre makers to move away from making work in traditional theatre buildings and move out into a site-specific context, I would argue is protest, or the desire to get freedom of expression. So to go back a little bit, we need to have a wee think about the historical context of a post-war, post-Second World War America and Britain, and give us a little bit of a sense of that. So what you had after the Second World War was a divided sort of community, where you had a younger generation of who were more liberally, socially minded, who were moving to the left, and a kind of quieter, conservative with a small c, adult population who were deeply concerned with the sort of moves of the radical left. It's very difficult to imagine, having grown up, born in the 90s and grown up, the kind of movements that happened during the 1960s, which was just such a real seminal moment in our recent past. That decade really changed so much stuff in the Western world about how we thought about things in terms of social policy and attitudes towards women, towards homosexuals, towards black people. There was real big cultural shifts happening during that time, and of course theatre had its part to play within this sort of shifting dynamic. So I would say, if we think about the notion of avoiding the censor, I would use the example of the Living Theatre, which was founded by Judith Molina and Julian Beck in 1947, and this was another New York-based theatre group. They were not really connected to the happenings people as such. They really started off in traditional theatre buildings, and they were trying to create a radical theatre, but not quite as experimental as or not quite as radical as the happenings. They were using just different forms of text, and they were trying to get playwrights to create more dynamic work, more interesting work, using audience participation and things like that. Usually their works involved getting naked somehow, or just they were playing, they were experimenting, and they were really trying to come up with new and fresh ideas of how to perform in theatre and things like that. But what you have is a kind of articulation of this sort of new left that are aspiring and trying to do new things and generate new ideas, and a kind of conservative establishment trying to quash that. You've got a perfect articulation of this in the Living Theatre, because they had real difficulty operating in a kind of traditional theatre setting, because they had the money in the funds and stuff to set up their own theatres. But what would happen is that government organisations would then come in and close them down. This happened multiple times. I've got a list here. So the authorities closed the Cherry Lane Theatre, which was closed by the fire department in 1953. The Living Theatre Studio on Broadway at 100th Street was closed by the Buildings Department in 1956. And the 14th Street Studio was closed by the IRS in 1963. So what you see is a kind of radical left trying to develop new and engaging work. Not site-specific, but just trying to engage with new and exciting work. And an authority deeply concerned by that. What is this company doing? Who is it speaking to? What is the messages it's trying to present? And of course there's two sides to every story, so there's maybe very valid reasons why the New York Fire Department had to close down and prevent the Living Theatre from making work in that space. But you would have to say that there's something a bit, you can connect the dots a little bit and sort of see that the authorities really were wanting to stamped down on this kind of like free thought, this kind of engaged, exciting work. So what happened from the 1960s onwards for the Living Theatre was that they kind of became a nomad company. They started travelling around and making work in protest of them not being allowed to make inside a theatre. And in fact they were freed by not being in a theatre. There was no rules, there was no regulations. They could make work in places, in parks or for chosen sites for people, and do their experiments and their radical things outside with people and bring them into it. And they found real artistic freedom by doing so. What's more than that is when you kind of came to the mid-60s, when you had the civil rights movement and civil rights movements, and you had sort of what many artists did this is that they kind of joined in the civil rights movement. They felt that they had a responsibility as part of the left, this new left, to help support the civil rights campaigns, and that's exactly what the Living Theatre did. And they would join the protests, they would go along, they would make work, and they would really be engaged in that political environment. So they were making work outside for protest. So they were out in protest of being chucked out of their theatre, and then they joined protests. So actually the establishment mobilised them and actually were implicit in helping them take that step into becoming a radical political theatre. So yeah, they were trying. So one motivation for leaving a theatre building is to escape the rules and regulations that are tied to a specific building, for example. So you maybe go and do work on site in order to avoid those things. Although there might be other rules that you need to be aware of. It's kind of that's the point, you choose. It's a choice that you make when you're doing site-specific work. You can choose a place that doesn't have those rules and regulations. So that's it. And then connected to that, you have a similar sort of thing in the UK, because in the 1960s that there was a comparative culture going on in the UK, where you have a radical new left, and you had the rise of anarchists, and you had subcultures like that. But nevertheless, a younger, socially driven left group, and a kind of quiet, silent majority, conservative with a small c, who are kind of worried about that. And these are two cultural sort of situations that are struggling to coalesce. And so there's a number of marches, the ban the bomb marches and all sorts of things going on during the 1960s that artists got involved in. And this is the birth of the agitprop theatre, which means agitprop means agitation propaganda. Originally it was referred to things that were going on in Russia and in China, which was literally these agitprop was like little things used to help promote. It was propaganda to promote a particular situation or whatever. But this is the way we think about it in the UK, is that agitprop theatre were groups that went to places like marches and demonstrations, and created small kind of stylised pieces of theatre with cardboard cutouts and big dummy costumes, and really they were trying to find metaphors for whatever situation they were trying to protest against, and portray them on a grand scale in a very simplistic kind of metaphor simile for that, and present it in a kind of funny way. And agitprop had a real re-emergence in the 1980s, or sorry, late 70s, and throughout the 80s when Thatcher came to power, and you had the deindustrialisation of sort of big major cities. You had the emergence of companies like Red Ladder, and who else was there? Red Ladder is the one that I know about, but also Northwest Spanner and Belt and Braces. These are agitprop companies who would, and this is site specific because they would go to the places where the problems were. They'd go to the mines, they'd go to the places where there was big, they'd go to the mines, and they'd also go to the steelworks and places where big factories and lots of workers were being let off and being made unemployed. And basically agitprop companies would find ways of expressing their anger, expressing the hypocrisy of the government, and present that in kind of simplistic ways that would be capturable in a kind of in an image that would help promote their views. You could only have that style of theatre at the locations. There'd be no point in making short agitprop works for a theatre space who a certain kind of audience is only going to come and see that. It was a targeted, piece of work for a purpose. We are making work to defend certain social rights. We're here to make this work. And the form of agitprop is a direct response to doing that, and it had to be made on location where there was kind of unrest. And lastly, and similar to that, again another form of protest, is that you have people really what I've titled here is targeting their marks, going after the people that they're unhappy with. Now this is probably more modern examples, but there's some really interesting things going on with the flash mob movement. Now flash mobs, as we maybe know them now, have kind of become a marketing tool more than anything else, and so we're kind of a bit switched off to flash mobs now because we just think of them as a Vodafone advert or something like that. Where actually there are really interesting flash mobs going on for political purposes, and companies, or sorry, organisations like Greenpeace and PETA, which is the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, have done quite radical street agitprop-y style flash mob works that have really tried to promote their agendas as organisations. I've got a really interesting example was in Switzerland in 2010. Greenpeace did a kind of really wide-ranging campaign where they got children and adults and groups all over Switzerland to do the very simple action at a specific time. They all had to drop dead. So whatever they were doing, mid-walk, playing football, whatever, it came to that time and they all just flopped down as if they were dead. So dramatic, and it happened around, so people would be walking and all of a sudden all these people collapsed. And it was terrifying, and that was a protest against the misuse of nuclear energy, and they were trying to promote the dangers, but a very effective, very powerful metaphor that would scare people, and that's a real, that is a targeted, we are going to do this kind of work. It's maybe not site specific in that it doesn't need to be at a particular place to happen, but it was so widespread all around cities in Switzerland where this happened that it had such a big impact at the time. And I've seen numerous examples of PETA's. They do some quite disturbing imagery where they wrap themselves up as chicken breasts or whatever, and lie outside supermarkets and things like that. And you should, if you type in PETA into Google Images, you'll see a number of quite disturbing images or whatever about the kinds of things that they do. But it is a form of protest. So when we consider, when we're considering, I'm sorry, hello, come here then. Come here then. My doggy's coming to say hello. Yeah, so when we're considering this sort of second key motivation for why theatre makers or anybody might choose to go and make work for a particular location, it is a protest. It is a way of reaching, targeting a specific sort of agenda.